So around page 136, he actually is talking now about pre-man, what it was like to live as a early Homo sapien. And he writes as if he was thinking like them. And he talks about what they eat and how they travel. And there's a couple little points I want to mention. He talks about fire and the early conquering of fire for the use for human purposes, which opened up a massive amount of activities for early man. So he says, this is on page 136. One of us had a brave and fearful thought to capture the flame, feed it a little, and make it our friend. We found some long branches of hard wood. The flame was eating them, but slowly. We could pick them up by the end that had no flame. If you run fast with a small flame, it dies. Their children are weak. We did not run. We walked, shouting good wishes. Do not die, we said to the flame. And then there's a footnote, and he says that Carl Sagan says that this sense of fire as a living thing to be protected and cared for should not be dismissed as a primitive notion. It is to be found near the root of many modern civilizations. Every home in ancient Greece and Rome and among the Brahmins of ancient India had a hearth and a set of prescribed rules for caring for the flame. So I thought that was an interesting point, the early use of fire and how important it was, especially for those early tribes who did make use of it to cook food, to protect themselves against animals instead of just being slaughtered by them all the time, which if you read Arthur C. Clarke, his Space Odyssey 2001 is a good job. The first third of the book is all about pre-man, and he does a really good job describing the plight of man before weapons and tools and fire. On the next page, on 137, he talks about the moon and how early man watched the moon, and in some cases worshipped the moon, and even connected it to women's menstrual cycles. Like he says, when the moon changes, the women bleed. So again, he's talking in the voice as if he is these pre-man. Some tribes have rules against sex at certain times in the growing and shrinking of the moon. Some tribes scratch the days of the moon or the days that the women bleed on antler bones. Then they can plan ahead and obey their rules. Rules are sacred. There's another point about the rules, whether rules is something that was so fundamental when survival was so precarious, and whether now, when survival is far less sensitive or prescribed or one way to live as it was then, if that's the case today, if there's many ways to survive and survival is a lot easier, then do we need rules as much? You can consider how artwork in the past, ancient Egypt is, I think, a good case, but certainly before that. Also, artwork was to be copied by the previous artist. Tradition was so important, and artists were never ever trained to be creative. They were trained to copy what was done in the past, and punished if they didn't, punished if they diverted. They were not to be creative whatsoever in their artwork. So again, there's this sense that there's certainly a very tribal, very ancient instinct or idea of people doing things a certain way because that is so crucial to survival. And you may even call it a conservative kind of value, tradition, because it's been practiced so often that we can anticipate its results. Is there a time in which, if survival is not as precarious, whether there is then space for innovation, at least there is safety for innovation, there is enough safety and security and prediction about the world and living in the world that we can engage in more rule breaking or subversion of rules, and thus creative aspects. And I guess you could also consider that there may be a breaking point, there may be a tipping point between when tradition guarantees your survival and either social conditions or global conditions in which innovation is survival. And you may even connect that to the ideas of global warming today. Those who believe that the world's going to end, the doomsayers of today, they may argue that today is where we definitely need to throw off all tradition, and we need to rely explicitly on any creative possibilities, whether they end in disaster or not. We need to test and practice anything that might save us, kind of thing, which is a very strange flip from what used to be the case in that tradition, and what we've always done is survival. Now we may be in a time where doing something completely erratic will guarantee our survival. So it's a very strange situation that a biological species would be in which tradition no longer works, and we don't know what works, and therefore we need to try as many things as possible. That kind of condition has never happened before, and how do we survive from that? Maybe just by luck, or maybe science is a kind of tradition and will give us the answer if we use it effectively.